Amen. All right, part 3 of our series on the Sabbath will be titled Nehemiah Fiercely Guarded the Sabbath. Nehemiah fiercely guarded the Sabbath. So we're going to continue on in the Old Testament, trying to understand what the Sabbath was, how it was practiced, why it was important, how it was important, and all those things. And I believe this will be our last study in the Old Testament concerning the Sabbath, and then we move on to the New Testament, and then and then try to answer the various questions as to what the Sabbath means to us today, and or how to overcome various objections concerning the Sabbath day. Okay, so we're gonna get going here. And I'm going to start this out with a verse from the great book of Psalms. Whoops, there we go. Psalms 119, verse 10. And I think this verse really sums up what we're trying to accomplish here with this series of studies. Psalms 119, many people know that this psalm was, I think is it the longest psalm in the Bible? I believe it is. And it's all about the psalmist praising God's law, talking about how holy it is, how wonderful it is, and how it brings life to people. In that, if you walk in His commandments, you're going to be avoiding sin and things like that. But this verse is just one of the many that we could pull out of it that can really be enriching to think about. Check this out. With my whole heart have I sought thee. Oh, let me not wander from thy commandments. Psalms 119, verse 10. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to seek God with all of our heart and not wander from His commandments. Now, someone say, well, Pastor Ben, that's still the Old Testament. We're in the New Covenant now. The law no longer applies. But if they had studied what the new covenant is in the book of Jeremiah, and I believe it was quoted in the book of Hebrews as well, that the new covenant would be God's law being written, His commandments being written on our hearts. So the psalmist here really is speaking of the new covenant before the new covenant. This is actually a new covenant verse. Seeking God with your whole heart and not wandering from His commandments, all right? So beautiful. That's what we're trying to accomplish here in this study. Obviously, we know from our prior studies that keeping the Sabbath was the fourth commandment, was and is the fourth commandment. All right, Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 1. We're going to see this story or this historical example of Nehemiah, the great man of God who helped rebuild Jerusalem. They got the walls built and all that, and they're trying to get back to being the people of God after having been in Babylon for 70 years, living under pagan rule and domination, and they didn't want that anymore. It was time to come out of Babylon. Nehemiah 9, verse 1, now in the 24th day of the month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and with sackcloth and earth upon them. Verse 2. All right. Hey, Jacob, can you pull that plug, please? Oh, you already did. That's still not working. All right. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. What does that mean? They separated themselves from all strangers. Well, the Israelites, not only did they live among people who didn't worship God, but they were yoked to them, okay? They're part of their everyday life was involved being with non-believers. And here they're coming out and separating themselves and confessing their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. So repentance, confession, separation are like one of the first things that you would do to get back to God. Separate yourself from the world. Verse 3, and they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law. Now check this out. What's the first thing they did is they confessed, they separated, they confessed, and now they're learning what? The law. Why would they learn the law? Well, Psalms 119, Nehemiah obviously knew that scripture and knew this was important because the law was holy, it's just, it's sweeter than honey, better than fine gold, all of those things, right? There's a reason why it's so precious. And they stood up in their place and read in the book of the law of the Lord, their God, 1/4 part of the day, and another 4th part they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. All right. Now I will say this, as we get into this series of studies a little bit more, one of the objections that people are going to bring up, and I'm just throwing this out in passing, we'll get really deep into this later on, is that the law no longer applies now in the new covenant. Now you just love God and love your neighbor, and that fulfills all of the law. And none of the specific laws, the commandments, they're just guidelines or suggestions now. They're not commandments anymore. They're just principles of life and all those types of things. But in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said emphatically that he did not come to change one jot or tittle of the law. Now people will say, well, it has to be changed because we're not sacrificing animals anymore and all that. Well, that's not moral law. Those were sacrifices that Jesus fulfilled. But the moral law, specifically the highest moral law, being the 10 Commandments, Jesus said he didn't come to change one jot or tittle of that. A jot or a tittle is one little letter. It's still written in stone. Not only that, but in the new covenant, it goes from being written in stone to being written deeper than stone. Think about this. Writing in stone is pretty deep. You got to take a metal chisel and you got to get in there and you got to really carve. How much more effort does it take for God to write it into somebody's heart? That's way deeper. Okay? We're not backing away from the law. We're going deeper into it because we know the law is holy, it's righteous, it's sweeter than, it's all of those things. And on top of that, we're going to find out later on in this series in the book of Romans, it's spiritual. The law is spiritual. Okay? Okay, so Jesus, I'll just comment a little further on this. Jesus said he didn't come to change one jot or tittle of the law. In fact, he said that those who say that the law is changed, those who teach men that one jot or tittle of the law have been changed, he said, will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Think about that. Think about that. Because like I said, as we'll overcome some objections, somebody will pull a verse or two from the Apostle Paul and try to say, oh, the whole law is done away with, or 4th commandment is now something totally different than what God intended it to be. And that's where you start. That's exactly what Jesus meant when he said, I didn't come to change one jot or tittle of the law. And so Jesus said, whoever teaches the law in Matthew chapter 5, does it and teaches it, will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so Nehemiah, why did I go into all that? Because Nehemiah, the first thing that he thought that they should be doing is studying the law of God and then worshiping and confessing sin. All right. Verse 4, or we're going to skip on to verse 13 here of Nehemiah chapter 9. Then camest down also upon Mount Sinai and spakest with them from heaven. So he's given a little summary of everything that God had done for the Israelites, reminding them of their history, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and commandments. Somehow we got to this era of lawlessness in the last 100 years plus, where preachers are saying that the law is bad. So if God ever created something that was good, righteous, it's perfect, it's holy, how then do people get to the New Testament and say that it's bad? All right? We ought to be on guard. It sounds a lot like what the serpent said to Eve, that the law was bad. Okay? Obeying God's commandments is bad. Verse 14, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant. Now keep in mind, they were living in Babylon. They didn't have laws, statutes, ordinances, or holy Sabbaths. Their life was a complete mess, filled with idolatry, sensuality, carnality, sin, lust for this, lust for that, idols here, idols there. And they're trying to get away from that and live according to God's commandments. Verse 15, and gave us them bread from heaven for their hunger, and brought us forth water for them out of... So basically what we're seeing here is this is like a second Exodus. When the children of Israel left Egypt under Moses, they were leaving the world then. They were separating themselves from the world. Now, during Nehemiah's time, they had been in captivity for 70 years. Now they're separating themselves from the world again. And gave us them bread from heaven for their hunger, and brought us them forth water for them out of the rock for their thirst, and promisest them that they should go in to possess the land which thou hadst sworn to give them. But they and our fathers dealt proudly, and hardened their necks, and hearkened not to thy commandments. Now think about this. All these pastors out there saying that the 10 commandments no longer apply anymore, and that you can just basically follow your heart, and that somehow that's the Holy Spirit. Obviously the Holy Spirit guides us, gives us the unctions and stuff. But if you think that every move you make is a move from the Holy Spirit, how do you know? How do you know that your heart isn't deceiving you? Okay. So we don't make our own ways. We don't make our own laws. We don't define our own righteousness. It's right here. Okay. It's right here in the Bible, in the law. But my point is that people deal proudly against God, harden their necks, and they don't listen to his commandments today, just like they did back then. It's no different. It's called pride. It's called stubbornness. It's called rebellion. It's called, I want to do it my way. I don't want to do it your way. There's no difference. There's no difference. It's just that Satan has gotten into the church and has gotten them to think the law doesn't apply anymore. So they go on righteously thinking they don't need to follow the law, and yet they're still pleasing God. It's a very subtle and crafty deception to make you feel like you're righteous when you are not, when you are unholy. All right? Because opposite of holy is unholy, and how do you define what's holy and clean? The law does. And it tells you what's unclean as well. Verse 17, and refused to obey. It's the same thing. It was the same thing with Eve, refused to obey. It was the same thing with Adam, because he was passive and refused to obey God, but rather obeyed his wife. And later on, the Israelites refused to obey. It always comes back to the prime root of obedience. Now think about this. If you don't, obviously we all sin, we all come short, and that's where Jesus comes in the picture. But if we don't have a desire to obey, I'll ask this, where does the lack of desire to obey come from? And I can answer it this way. Jesus said in the New Testament, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Love brings obedience. Lack of love brings rebellion. How's that so? Well, if I don't want to obey God, it means that I am selfishly wanting to fulfill my own desires because I don't really care what he thinks. My way is my way. Now think about that. As we go on further into the Sabbath day is now called the Lord's Day by Christians and has been for approximately 2,000 years. The Lord's Day is the Lord's Day. It's his day. It's not our day. And it's one day in 7 that we relearn that lesson over and over again, and we habitually practice refraining from our own worldly pursuits, leaving the world and spending time with him. All right, but they refused to obey, neither were mindful of thy wonders that thou didst among them, but hardened their necks in their rebellion, and in their rebellion appointed a captain to return to the bondage. But thou art a God ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and forsookest them not. Even after all of their disobedience, God still was willing to accept them upon them, wanting to come back, repenting, and so forth. But what was this? They appointed a captain to return to their bondage. What was that guy's name? Well, after they left Egypt, God just freed them. What was his name? Dathan. They wanted to go back to Egypt because they didn't want that. They lacked faith and thinking that God would provide for them through the wilderness. And they said, it would be better for us to go back to Egypt than to die out here in the wilderness. All right. How many people start their Christian walk and say it would be better to go back to the world and serve idols than to live a risky, so-called risky life serving God? But risky, that I mean, you don't always, the future doesn't always look easy or certain. There's obstacles, there's challenges. But people want to fall back into the comfort of worshiping idols. I get my daily food. Nobody persecutes me. I can keep my job if I don't get the force mark of the beast or the big V. I'm not saying that's the mark of the beast, but it's along the same lines. You do this or else. And all those types of things, okay? It's just easier to go with the flow. I want to go back to the world where the gods of Egypt protected me and there was plenty of food and all I had to do was keep building the idols and bowing down to them every day and I felt comfort. All right, Jeremiah, we're going to come back to Nehemiah, but I wanted to go over to Jeremiah 17, verse 20. Because Jeremiah also talks about the Sabbath, and we're going to hear what he has to say about it. It'll tie into what our theme is today about guarding the Sabbath. And God says, and say unto them, hear ye the word of the Lord, ye kings of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem that enter in by these gates. Verse 21. It's really slow today for some reason. All right. Verse 21. Thus saith the Lord, take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day. Just coming right from God here. He says, take heed to that. You be on guard that you don't do this, right? And bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by thy gates of Jerusalem. Bearing no burden means I don't want you carrying in a bunch of goods, things that you bought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Verse 22, neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, neither do you any work, but what? But hallow ye the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. Okay, so it's obviously important to God, right? Hallow it. That means set it apart as holy. Make it special unto the Lord. You know, we do this. It's amazing. We do this for our own kids. Families do this all the time. We've got, for instance, we've got I'll go to all the holidays that we have, right? We got Mother's Day, we got Father's Day, we have this day, that day, we have birthdays. Think about some of these parents. I mean, they will decorate the house. They will spend hundreds of dollars on their kids, and they make a big ordeal out of their kid's birthday, right? But then the Lord's Day comes around and says, do they set up banners for the Lord in their house? Praise the Lord, it's the Lord's Day. Do they even observe the Sabbath? Do they even spend time in His Word on a weekly basis? So the Sabbath was just that. It was a day of celebration, a day that God called His day, His holy Sabbath. But yet we hallow birthdays. We set them apart as sacred and separate, and we celebrate them. But yet our culture doesn't hardly, the day of the Lord, the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, isn't hallowed anymore. Think about Super Bowl Sunday. Think about all of the other special sporting events that go on, how we hallow those. We set those apart on our calendar as a very important date. But somehow we think in the New Testament, God doesn't need any more of our time, any more of our devoted time. If we give Him an hour here or there, that's good enough. But a whole day, I mean, He's already getting an hour here and there of me. I don't need to give Him a whole day. Well, tell that. But why don't you do that for your kids? I already give them an hour. I give them all kinds of hours. Why do I have to set aside a day for their birthday? Because the whole day is a special thing, right? There's something special about observing an entire day. There's a difference, okay? And when you do that, it becomes a non-negotiable, right? A non-negotiable thing. And people will treat anniversaries, birthdays, and all that as non-negotiable things. But then when it comes to setting aside time for God, maybe you could give them Christmas, but you're going to give them Santa Claus as well. Maybe you could give them Resurrection Day, but then you're going to have an Easter bunny and eggs. Yet we always got to share. You can't let God have His own day. We got to add in other things to His day. But if it's for somebody else that we can see in person, we somehow feel like, since I can see the reaction on their face and see the disappointment, let's say your kid's birthday rolls around and you don't even say happy birthday, or you don't say anything, you don't decorate, no present, you now have to face their face going, you didn't think about me today. You forgot about me. Okay? Imagine a lot of people's anniversaries. Husbands get in a lot of trouble for forgetting the anniversary. The wife's upset. This is a special day. Think about, just because we can't see God's physical reaction, we think it's not there. How about every time He says, I want you to meet me here once a week at this day, and then you don't show up? Is that hurtful for Him, or does He say, it's okay? Okay, they think about me the other times. Well, I think about my kids all the time, but if I forget their birthdays, they're still upset, right? See the equation there. All right. So if God has to tell the Israelites back here in Jeremiah about the Sabbath day and what not to do and what to do, what does that mean? They probably did this. Okay, I'll just, instead of me saying it, we'll have God say it. But God say it. But they obeyed not, neither inclined their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction. Do you think their same reasonings and objections to the Sabbath were very much different than they are today? Why we can't set aside a day for God? They did it back then. They didn't have the excuse of the new covenant. They didn't have the excuse of that. But they had what would be some of the same excuses? Well, the Lord's Day is a burden. I want to do what I want to do, right? They obeyed not, but made their necks stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction. The point is, we come up with different kinds of reasoning, but the heart of the reasoning behind not wanting to obey the Sabbath today as it was back then is the same. It's selfishness. You can have a day to celebrate you or to do your pleasure, But God forbid that we ever give God a day to celebrate him, because that's too much. 1 day out of 7 is too much for us to give up. It's got to be ours. You see how that works? Jeremiah 17, verse 24. And it shall come to pass, if you would diligently hearken unto me, saith the Lord, to bring in no burden through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day, and to do no work therein, then, there's the if, and then here's a then shall there enter into the gates of this city kings and princes sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain forever. Think about that. God says, if you keep the Sabbath day, then your king, you're going to have an unbroken line of kings sitting on the throne of David, and your nation will remain forever. By keeping the Sabbath. How does this apply to families today? How many families today are broken apart and separated, and heritages are lost because of not setting aside a day for the Lord? And now your families are following an unbelieving example, an example of me first, something else first before God. And they're not going to stay together. They're going to separate. Why? Because sin separates. The Sabbath was a day of holy instruction. It was a day of unity. It was a day of healing. It was a day of setting our mind apart from the world and thinking about the things of God. All those things that would keep a family together. All those things that would keep a family together. So what applies to the national family of Israel applies to even the family units today. I hear of so many, I've heard of so many stories of families that have kept the Lord's Day, a Sabbath, and have kept it as a day of spiritual instruction, a day of just separating from the world, being with the people of God, being with family. And you hear of the many, many blessings that have come upon those types of families. But the families that would prioritize sports or work, this or that, they're in turmoil. They're falling apart. Idolatry has taken over. Verse 26, and they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places about Jerusalem and from the land of Benjamin and from the plain and from the mountains and from the south, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices and meat offerings and incense, and bringing sacrifices of praise unto the house of the Lord. But if and then, here we go, if you will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day and not bear a burden, you still want to, bring a bunch of trade and commerce, participate in a bunch of trade and commerce on that day. This would be equivalent to shopping. You want to fill your cart on the Sabbath day, right? You're going to go to Costco and it's Sunday. I don't have to work today at my normal job. So now I'm going to get all my errands done and I'm going to buy all my stuff and bring all my burdens with me, pack it up in my car, drive home and all that. Okay. Some people look at the Sabbath day now as a day to catch up. Sunday is the day that I catch up and get ready for the week. I run all my errands. But is that what the day was in the Bible? That's the question. Even entering in at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, now check this out, then will I kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. Now let me ask you this question. What happened to the nation of Israel? Did they remain in Jerusalem forever? No, we know the Babylonians came and did what? They burned up the city. We did a series of studies. We covered the whole book of Lamentations here in this room. And we read about the horrors of the Babylonians coming and raping and pillaging the women and burning down the houses. My friends, the seeds of this is already here today. And why is it? Well, when we look back at American history, and we'll soon do that, we're going to find out there were they're called blue laws. There were law after law in every state throughout the Union that kept the Sabbath holy. Okay? That kept the Lord's Day as the Sabbath. And then, specifically in the 1960s is when it really happened, but there was a downward slide. Come around 1960, I believe that's when the Supreme Court started striking down a lot of the Sabbath laws, the Sunday laws. And now what's happening? The whole nation's falling apart. So really, if you look at it, the Sabbath day is such an important day. It is really, literally, scholars believe it is the measure. It is, I could say it as truth. It's the measure here. God used it as the measure here. If and then. If you keep it, your nation will stay together. If you don't keep it, your nation's going to fall apart. I'll add it this. If you keep the Sabbath, as a family, your family stays together. If you violate the Sabbath, your family will separate to their idols. They will all go to their idols. And there will not be a set-aside time to meet and celebrate the Lord's Day. Verse 28 of Nehemiah, back to Nehemiah chapter 10. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, and so now they're coming back after. So the book of Nehemiah was after the city of Jerusalem got burned. So what do we see there? Though the Israelites disobeyed, God is still showing them mercy. But he did punish them first. Right? He didn't say, I'm going to show mercy and not punish. No, they deserve the punishment, but he'll give the mercy by taking them back and letting them try again. And that's what this is about. Verse 28, and the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the what? Law of God. But Pastor Ben, if I obey the law of God today, the people of the land, people in my community, people around me are going to think I'm a little bit strange. Come on, guys. Do you not realize that it was the same thing for them back then? They had the same desires, the same. I'm already living in this place. I'm already doing all these different things with these people. I don't want to separate myself to the law of God because I'm going to miss out on something. Okay? Their feelings and emotions were no different then than they are for us today. They weren't some rotten people, way worse sinners than us. How dare these people? These people were absolute losers, we'd say. How would they choose the heathen over God's people? Well, the same way our nation's doing it today. Separating themselves from the people of the lands unto what? The law of God. Their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. Verse 29. Whoops, one too far. They clave to their brethren. Okay, you're forsaking the world, and now what are you doing? You're cleaving to your brethren. This would be the same as cleaving with fellow believers. And clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath to walk, this is a covenant, a curse and an oath is a covenant, to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, that same law that Jesus says, I did not come to change one jot or tittle. And if you teach men so, you're going to be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But if you do the opposite and you exalt the law, you will be called great. And then you get to the book of Revelation that I quote day in and day out every week that we meet here. The overcomers are those in the book of Revelation 12 and others are those that strive to keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. to walk in God's law, which was given by the servant of God, to observe and to do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his judgments and his statutes. Verse 30. And that we would not, now check this out, this is important, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. Okay? Now, this is so important in these days. On the most basic level, right? On the most basic level, you do not want to get married to a non-Christian person. Okay? You do not want to marry a spiritual Canaanite. On a deeper level, when you understand, the tribes of Israel and how there are 144,000 sealed, even in the future. A lot of people don't even realize there are these tribes. It's important for God that the nations still remain, they still keep their identity into the eternity. Israel is still a separate nation from the other nations. They're all good, but they all have a different place. They have different boundaries. We're not going to have this. It's not going to be like America, okay? And people think heaven's going to be this great melting pot where everybody just mixes together and there's no differences. It doesn't matter. That's not the way the kingdom of heaven is going to be. It's going to be, there's going to be nations. The nations will come up to Jerusalem to offer their gifts and sacrifices into the land of Israel, okay? The nation of Israel. So it's important. That's part of following the law, is understanding also when Nehemiah is going through all this stuff, heritage. Your family heritage is so important. There was a man who did not care about his heritage. And we know what happened to that man. He went and married foreign women. And that man was Esau. Okay? Esau, God hated. Jacob was the person whom God loved. Esau didn't care about his family heritage. Jacob did. Verse 31. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we could not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we should leave the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. In other words, this was part of the covenant they entered into, Nehemiah and the rest of the remnant of Judah that returned. They said they're not going to buy or sell goods on the Sabbath day. They're not going to be they're not going to be lading up their asses with all kinds of, they're not going to be worried about worldly things. They're going to do that on the other 6 days. And also they were going to celebrate or honor, this will be another topic we might get into, the seventh year Sabbath. Okay? Not only were they going to honor the seventh day Sabbath, but the seventh year Sabbath. And it was going to be a wonderful blessing to them. Verse 32, Nehemiah 13, verse 15. What were we? We were on 10, chapter 10, verse 31. Now we're in Nehemiah 13, verse 15. We're going to skip over to there. And I believe this chapter will conclude our study here. The title of the study was Nehemiah Fiercely Guarded the Sabbath. And we talked about the Sabbath. We covered a bunch of different things about the Sabbath, how important it was to God, and how he said that if you do this, if you keep it, if you hallow it, your nation will remain forever. You'll be blessed. You're going to ride on high. You're going to have everything. But if you don't, I'm going to burn down your city with fire. Nehemiah knows that. He knows that's what happened to Israel. One of their major sins, believe it or not, was the violation of the Sabbath. Not only the Sabbath day, but the Sabbath year. And 70 years, the actual punishment pronounced upon Israel was 70 years in captivity. It was because they had, I think when you do the mathematics, God said that the land will now enjoy her Sabbath. So I think they skipped. It sounds like they probably skipped 70 Sabbaths, yearly Sabbaths. It's a lot. 490 years. All right. Nehemiah 13, verse 15. Check this out. In those days, I, Nehemiah, saw In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. So Nehemiah testifies against them, all right? He knew this was a violation. Verse 16. There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, who brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah in Jerusalem. Now, as we get into this, how do we apply the Sabbath? Start thinking ahead a little bit, okay? These were foreigners selling stuff to Israelites. 17. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto, contended means, hey, look, listen, a man of God sometimes has to contend for the truth. Contending isn't necessarily a passive, hey guys, we shouldn't be doing this. It could be a very abrasive conversation like, what the heck are you guys doing here? Why are you violating the laws of God? To the elders of Judah, nobles of Judah. And said unto them, what evil thing is this that you do, and profane the Sabbath day? Now think about that. Back in the Old Testament, at least, since we haven't gotten to all the application, this was evil. This was the definition of evil, to be buying and selling on the Sabbath day. Did not your fathers this? Did they not do this? Now he's referring to the children of Judah, the nation of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. He says, did not they do the exact same thing? Here we are trying to restore our nation, and now you're doing the very thing that brought destruction upon our nation. You're allowing this to happen. The nobles, the leaders, the politicians. And we're actually also going to get into that a little bit, going back to the blue laws. We're going to find out that there were struggles between churchmen trying to get our politicians to keep the Sabbath holy and from profaning it. There was this big ordeal back in the 1830s where the post office made their workers work on the Sabbath day, and the church, many in the church, rose up against it and spoke against the national government for violating the Sabbath. And we're going to see there was a whole historical ordeal about that in America. Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Think about this, guys. One of the major sins of why the Babylonians came into Jerusalem and burned it to pieces, raped the women, did all these terrible things was because they didn't want to hallow a day for the Lord. They wanted all 7 days to be theirs. It's mine, mine, mine. Yet you bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So here we see in Old Testament times, at least, profaning the Sabbath equaled what? Wrath of God. You profane it by treating it common. You trample it with your foot. You do your own pleasure instead of honoring God. Wrath of God comes. Okay? Some would say that's not fair. Okay? Well, forget about your anniversary and see if your wife is going to be happy about it. Okay? We'll use that analogy so we can put this on a personal level. Nehemiah 13, verse 19. And it came to pass that when the gates... Here's one thing I like to think about. For the Israelites back then, it was very difficult for them to submit and to just give a day to God, right? And to stop the worldly cares and things. And it was for their own good. I don't want to say this was... Our last study was the Sabbath is a delight. If you delight in it, it's going to be a wonderful blessing to you. But here we go. We got the creator of the universe, right? The creator of the universe created the heavens and the earth for man and says on 6 days, you guys can dominate this place. You can cultivate it. You take charge of it. But I just want the one that seventh day for me. And you think about everything he's given us. He just wanted us to learn how to give back a little bit. And only asking for 1/7 of our time. 1/7 of our time. You can have the other 6/7. But we find it hard, and we all do because we're sinful by nature. We all find it hard to want to give that back to God. And we know that in our earlier studies that it was actually the Sabbath. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt. He brought them into the wilderness, and the first thing he did was tested them to see if they would keep his law or no. How did he test them? To see if they would obey the Sabbath. Verse 19, and it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath. I know some people are probably thinking, well, Pastor Ben's, he's in the Old Testament. He's getting a little forceful about the Sabbath. What do you think Nehemiah was doing back then? Or what? I'm trying to bring out the emotions that were in the scriptures at this time. It was so serious that it meant the life or death of the nation then. I feel it likely is the same exact thing because I'm looking at history. I see that our nation had laws for the Sabbath and now we don't anymore. And I see where we're at and I see our cities already just a couple years ago burning up in fire. The heathen running around like animals, trashing police stations, jumping on top of police cars. That's only probably the beginning, my friends. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded, so Nehemiah wasn't a suggestion kind of guy, commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants sat I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now think about this. They just finished building the wall around Jerusalem. They were having a problem with people profaning the Sabbath by being outside of Jerusalem. They were going and buying stuff from the heathen and coming into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And Nehemiah forcibly, by law and by force, shut the gates, put armed guards there, and says, you're not profaning the Sabbath. Think about that. If somebody was to do this today, we would call them a what? A legalist. You're a legalist because you're trying to guard and protect your people. Nehemiah did this out of love. He didn't do this because he was some kind of a Pharisee that said, I just want to control what you do. I'm going to make all these extra laws and rules. These were the most basic things that you were not to do on the Sabbath day. These were not extra man-made rules. These were God-made commandments, okay? God-made laws. And Nehemiah was doing his duty as the governor of Judah to enforce that. Now think about this. You think about all the men and families that we have today. Every man should have a gate around his house, keeping the ungodly out, and we should be setting our own guards up there, figuratively and or spiritually, and keeping the wickedness out. It is our duty. It is what God called man to be. He didn't call man to be this, open up the gates, I'll accept it this time. Oh, we'll just do a little bit of this. A little bit of idolatry is okay. There has to be boundaries. There has to be a wall of separation. There has to be a no, you're not doing this. And it has to be out of love because you don't want to see the destruction of your family, your nation, your people. And you'll see this all throughout history. Reformers like Nehemiah would raise up and do this kind of thing. But yeah, Nehemiah today, the New Testament do everything you want type of a Christian would say, oh, Nehemiah, well, it was okay for him back then, but anybody that would want to try to obey the laws of God today is a legalist, But, well, then you go back to Matthew chapter 5, and Jesus said, I've come not to change one jot or tittle of the law. So is Jesus, by that definition of a legalist, Jesus himself is a legalist. I don't think these guys are legalists. I think the problem is you don't have the proper understanding of what man-made laws are, traditions of men are, versus the commandments of God. And you might want to take an easy way out and just say, it's all legalism. No, this is the law of God. These are the commandments of the Pharisees. We obey the commandments of God. And we shun the commandments of the Pharisees. We don't just say anything in the law is no longer applicable and we can just live a lawless life. Because like we'll bring this up many times, there is going to be a group of professed Christians that will meet Christ, Jesus says. And he says they're going to say they've healed in his name, cast out demons, done many wonderful works. And Jesus looks at them and says, get out of my sight. I never knew you. You that work what? Lawlessness. You that hated the Nehemiahs. Okay? You that disliked the Nehemiahs. You that called those that wanted to protect your country legalists, racists, bigots. Okay? That's the kind of Christian that Jesus is going to reject. The lawless. Okay? Not the follow your heart kind of person, that is the follow your heart kind of person, okay? The hippie Jesus. I love reading about men like Nehemiah because I feel like it is our God, as a man of God, it is in our DNA. The Spirit presses upon us to be firm with boundaries. And I feel like the world tells us that that's not right. And then you read about Nehemiah and you feel this sense of relief, like I'm doing what God wants me to do in setting boundaries and setting limits. And if one man stands with God, he already beats the majority, right? We found that. This is a story. This has gone on since the beginning of time. Daniel in the lion's den. Men of God are very rare. Men of God are not liked by the world because they convict of sin and they set boundaries. They build walls. They build gates. Back here, Nehemiah, you'd say, well, come on. Legalist guy, he's building a wall. He's separating the people. It's probably a cult, man. Probably a cult. He's keeping the children of Judah separate from the nations and doesn't want these other non-Sabbath violators from the other people to come in on the Sabbath day. That's a little restrictive, a little too much. It's always been that way. People have always looked upon the prophets and the men of God like that. All right. I honestly didn't intend for this to be a huge defense of the Sabbath today. I wanted to look back at how Nehemiah protected then and try to stay objective until we get to the New Testament objections on the Sabbath. Like somebody will pull out the book of Colossians or take 2 or 3 verses of Paul's writings and kind of make it seem like we have 9 commandments instead of 10 now, or that we spiritually follow one of them and physically follow the other 9, that kind of thing. But I feel like it's okay to jump ahead a little bit there, right? Nehemiah 13, verse 20. So the merchants and the sellers of all kind were lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. Think about this. All these merchants, and think about what's happened to like holidays that are like Christmas, okay? The Puritans didn't celebrate Christmas. I'm not saying we have to go that far. But how it's turned into a commercial enterprise, right? Commercialism is always trying to get its way in to God's holy nation, to his holy days. Look at this. They're literally on the Sabbath day. These merchants got their tables out there. They're camped around there. They're like trying, probably like, hey, dude, you in there? You don't need to worship the Sabbath. Come on out here. Quick. You got only $5 today. You know, just it's a special Sunday special deal. Sunday only. Or Saturday back then. Saturday. All right. And we laugh about that, but honestly, at the beginnings of when the Sabbath was starting to be broken, the temptation was there in history. There were instances of people getting better deals. And even today, some people get paid more for working on the Lord's Day. But now it really doesn't, that was more of a temptation back then. Now it's just an accepted thing. Nehemiah 13, verse 21. Then I testified against them. Against them, Nehemiah. And said unto them, why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. That's why I love this guy, right? Listen, it took force. It takes men of God like Nehemiah to scare evil away at times, right? These guys were going to just stay around there until Nehemiah physically threatens to grab them by the neck and do whatever to them if they do this again. And so they came no more on the Sabbath day. Beautiful. All right. Now I'm going back to this a little bit too, because, this is a huge thing in our society. And we've talked about this a little bit. Satan's main goal, first, before he destroys a nation, before he destroys a family, before he destroys a culture, is to go, Jesus said he's going to bind the strong man first. There we saw an instance of the strong man, Nehemiah, putting the wall out there, putting guards at the gate, and then physically threatening the Sabbath violators out there. He was the strong man. Satan couldn't bind him. Now, Nehemiah could have been, I'm sure the nobles of Judah, he was testifying against them, right? They were arguing. Nehemiah was saying, you're profaning the Sabbath. You're allowing this to happen. He didn't give up. He didn't give in to the nobles of Judah and say, okay, well, let's make a few exceptions here and a few exceptions there. No, he went and guarded the Sabbath. All right. Now, I really feel like if you're somebody who's on the fence about the Sabbath right now, at least take this example. We have to guard our families from idolatry, from sin, and we have to sometimes be forceful when doing that. You cannot make compromises. And this is you think about, Nehemiah's time wasn't much different than it is today. If you're a family, that the rest, everything around you is trying to get in, okay? Is trying to get in. And it's like a nonstop job of trying to deflect those things that are trying to get in. And it's always going to be that way on this side of eternity, I believe, until the millennium era is set up and Jesus' law, God's law, is the law of the land. All right, so we will be right back. We're going to, like I said, that'll be our last study in the Old Testament. We're going to move into the New Testament because I know a lot of people are thinking, well, the Pharisees really believed in the Sabbath and Jesus didn't because he healed on the Sabbath. We're gonna put all that in context. We're going to go through, like I said, I don't want to leave, with this series of studies, I don't want to leave one stone unturned because I feel like we're seeing the effects of our nation and our families not observing it. And you see the importance of it in the Old Testament, how it was the measure of a nation surviving or not. So I feel like it can't be one of those topics that we just set aside and say, they believe this, I believe that. Now let's just all go our own way type of thing. Because I feel like the very gates of our country, the very pillars of our country are about to burn down. And at least if they do, some of our families' gates and pillars can remain in place. At least you can protect your own family. All right, we will be right back with questions and comments. Be sure to join us live every Thursday morning, 9:30 a.m. for prophecy updates and Sunday mornings, 10:30 a.m. for our line-by-line Bible studies. If you live near Princeton, Minnesota, and would like to join us in person for our Sunday morning church services, please email me at ben@christianovercomers.com for details and directions. Also, be sure to visit our website at christianovercomers.com to sign up for our weekly email updates, find our latest prophecy updates on video or podcast, catch up with our line-by-line studies, also available on video or audio podcast. And we even archive all of our studies by date. So if you have a phone or a tablet, bookmark this page so you can play our studies on the go while you're driving, going for a run, or doing chores. Now to our questions and comments. All right, we are right back with questions and comments. Sorry. Do we have any online comments? Yeah. All right. Does somebody want to read them? Jacob?
Philip Evans says, question. Some point to Exodus 31:13 and suggest that the Sabbath was for Israel only as a sign between God and Israel. I would like to be able to answer that person.
Great point. So, yeah, that's one of the things that the antinomians will often bring up. They'll bring that up. Antinomians means those that think the law no longer applies. But when you go back to the creation, it took God 6 days to create the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh he rested. And it also says that he hallowed the day. He made it holy. So if God made a day holy, it's not just for himself. It was for Adam and his descendants. And in the New Testament, and we'll get more, like I said, we'll be having lots of fun when we get into the New Testament on this. Jesus said man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And he was referring back to creation. He was referring back to Adam, right? So the Sabbath, Adam actually lived his first full day of life was the Sabbath day. It's very interesting. His first full day of life was the Sabbath, because Adam wasn't here on day 1 through 5. He was created someday on day 6, and his first full day was enjoying rest with God in Eden. Amazing. All right, so Jesus' words said, when you look at the creation account, God rested and made the day holy, and then you go to Jesus' words where he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He didn't say the Sabbath was made for Israel. Okay, so we know Sabbath has always been here since creation. It's just, and we could go down this trail too. Physical, mental, and spiritual health all need a seventh day rest. Doctors have studied these things, and they know that people, there was I was reading some stuff, I'm trying to remember. There were some really smart people that use their brains all the time, right? Inventing things, scientists, but they never stopped trying to invent those, worldly things. We're not talking about thinking about God's things, right? And so they're always continually thinking about and focus on these worldly things and invent. And a lot of these guys ended up going mad. Their brain, in other words, their physical body didn't wear out, but their mental health deteriorated because their mind never had a break from thinking about those things. Just as a laborer, from the time of Adam on, our bodies aren't any different, right? The atmosphere could be, but our bodies aren't. If we can't sustain working 7 days a week nonstop without a day of rest, then neither could have anybody before Israel, right? they could have done it, but they're getting sick, they're getting broken down, they're getting diseased, they're having all kinds of physical problems. So in other words, your mind and your body both need that rest. It's just nature. It's from creation. It's not just a sign that was for Israel. Now we'll get into a little bit later on about that sign. A lot of early Christians, there was this big debate, and my son and I talk about this a little bit too, about the Sabbath, whether it's Saturday or Sunday. It was initially Saturday, right? But then the Christians started observing it on Sunday. Well, Sunday was traditionally known as a pagan rest day. So there's an argument saying the Christians took on the pagans and all that. We'll get into that, the Lord's Day and the Sabbath. But what's interesting, when you talk about it being a sign, the early Christians thought it was a sign to take the first day of the week and make that the seventh day, or the Sabbath, to be that cycle. That was a sign. They viewed that as a sign of separation from those that did not believe in Jesus, under, those that practiced Judaism. So the Lord's Day became a sign that they were Christians. They were different from the unbelieving Jews. So that I know that wasn't really his question, but I just elaborated on the sign of what the purpose was. Well, it actually is part of that, because people had stopped following the Sabbath, right? And not observing it, obviously. And so when God took Israel out of Egypt, they were following all of the Egyptian ways. They didn't observe a day of rest. And so them keeping the Sabbath that was supposed to be kept from creation was a sign to the world that they are God's people. Do we have any other questions?
Well, the Ten Commandments are not just for Israel.
Right? Yeah. I mean, the foreigners can't murder somebody and say we're not under the law. It's for Israel, right? I think the Apostle Paul talks about it, that even in nature we know, deep down inside, we do know what's right and wrong. We do know when we've violated the laws of God. There's that instinct that's inside of us. But at the same time, I believe that God's laws were probably given to Adam and had been known in some form, or the Ten Commandments had been known in some form or another ever since creation. And that it was codified there. Well, look at Nehemiah. Here's a perfect example. They were entering into a curse and an oath with God to walk in his laws. Well, those laws weren't new. They were already there. They were just now saying, okay, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna agree, and I didn't read all the scriptures where they actually literally signed their names to it, like sort of like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, where our forefathers put their names on there and says this is what we're gonna do. They literally did that. They put their names, they affixed their names to that covenant. It was the old covenant renewed, if you would. And so I think the Sabbath, every time a people or a nation starts observing the Sabbath, they're just renewing something they were supposed to have been doing since the beginning of time.
Well, and I think in the Old Testament, it's kind of a history book for us and what we should watch out for. I mean, Israel, this is what happened, so don't do what Israel did, or don't, if what they did wrong.
Yeah.
Because now we're living in the time of Jesus, but you were supposed to follow, and watch what happened in the Old Testament, so we don't do the same thing.
You're exactly right. The Apostle Paul said that in was it Corinthians, that all of those stories in the Bible were examples and ensamples for us to learn from, so we don't repeat the same things as they did. And so that's a good point that you brought that up, because the Sabbath violation was huge in the Old Testament. And we just read about it, right? It's why one of the primary reasons why Israel went into Babylon. And if that no longer applies anymore, what kind of an example is that? If there's no longer a day, if it's just some kind of a spiritual rest. Now, there is something that we'll get into. The promised land that the Israelites went into was called, them entering into the promised land was a form of rest. They rested from their journeys, from the wars and all that. It was a time of rest. But it wasn't it was a form of Sabbath, but it wasn't the fourth commandment Sabbath. It was a spiritual rest from all of the battles and all of the work it took to get there. It was a form of rest, but it wasn't the seventh day Sabbath or the fourth commandment. And Jesus ultimately is that promised land rest. He doesn't replace, I don't believe as we get into this, he didn't replace the fourth commandment rest, because literally the fourth commandment rest is us practicing world aside rest in Jesus. So he's not going to take something away that actually causes people to rest in him. On the Sabbath day, the Christians have been for 2,000 years resting in Jesus on the Lord's day. And so he's not going to take away something that actually brings people to him. It's really kind of silly. And if there was no day, there was no appointed time, how are we all going to even know when to meet together and do it? The Bible also speaks about unity, how important unity is. If everybody is meeting on different days, all the Christians, there's no unity there. If somebody says, well, we're going to meet on Monday, we're going to meet on Tuesday, we're the church of Wednesday, we're the church of Thursday, we're the church of Friday, you've created a division there. Well, the law in England and in America made the Christian Sabbath day, the Lord's day, all the same day, and everybody stopped at the same time, and they could fellowship with each other. Think about this: you can't enforce a Sabbath day in your nation. You can't make laws and say no stores are open on the Sabbath day if some people observe it on different days. You'd never be able to enforce that. And so it's the Bible speaks. What's really interesting is when you look at the Sabbath day and you look at all the objections to it, the Sabbath day itself helps you do all of the things that Jesus commands us to do. To not forsake the assembling of the saints, to be with your brethren, and to worship, to do this and that. That just following God's calendar literally just helps you do that so much. It's not the end. I mean, it's not going to solve every one of your problems, but it definitely, if it's not observed, I think will bring all the other problems into your life. But it definitely is like a reset button that really is just designed to work naturally and to work. I can say this, there's never been any other system that's better, because it hasn't worked. Any of this really loose interpretation of it, or trying to take all the all the other binding things from it, right? As far as introducing all kinds of recreation and sports on the Sabbath day. It's not making anything any better for our culture. So like I said, for us, the huge thing is, and somebody might think I'm kind of teaching this chapter pretty forcibly, and I intended to be a little bit more gentle with this topic, but reading Nehemiah, the Spirit cannot let that be preached in a different emotion than what was going on there. That wasn't a soft spoke. Nehemiah wasn't softly, when he says he's going to lay his hands on somebody if they encamp around the Sabbath day anymore. It wasn't a gentle, soft spoken, comforting word to the Sabbath breakers. It was very stern. And so, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but sports is one thing that's really hard for us, because our kids are in youth sports, and we do believe in the value of youth sports, but we also see it in not only our family at times, but other families. It can easily become an idol. It can easily become the thing that you do before everything else. Think about this. How many people and I'm not disincluding myself from this, how many people will black out their calendar and it all revolve around where their kids are going to be playing on Sunday, and on top of that, spend thousands upon thousands of dollars on the sport, but not do anything to support the church in their local community, like a Bible church community. In other words, you can see a family that could spend $20,000 on sports, and that might even be a low level with hotels and all that, and not even give a nickel to their local church. And so you see the obsession. I've been in youth sports for heavily involved in youth sports for coaching and board and stuff like that. And some people use sport very good. They're able to weigh it out and keep it in perspective and want sports to be a good thing. But you do see the opposite element where it is an absolute obsession. If my kid doesn't do this or that, they're going to fall behind. And trying to get on the outside at looking in, sometimes it's easier to see it in somebody else than it is yourself. When you see somebody else do it, it's a lot easier to say, that's ridiculous. They're nuts. But then they might be looking at you and saying, you're nuts for having 5 kids in sports, 5 kids in sports, and you're always here on Sunday and you're here every other day of the week. They might think, you know what I'm saying? And I do think this is a good time for soul searching, because as good as youth sports is, when you start studying, since it was the year 2011, I think youth sports, the amount of money that has gone into it has doubled or tripled or something. It's a huge money-making industry. And we forget, when we talk about the Sabbath day, we forget that, Nehemiah, not all this buying and selling, but you forget how many people are employed, let's say, in certain sports facilities or whatever. There are people there that are working and are employed on those days. Right. So, but it has become commercialized to the point where I think it's to the detriment, not only of our kids, but to, spiritual life, because it is becoming the one thing that we will do and we will sacrifice everything else for. When you look up the definition of idolatry in the Webster's Dictionary, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was something that you spend a lot of time doing, you make sacrifices for, and so on. And so that could be anything. I mean, idolatry can be, let's say if you have a farm and you're going to work, so you're not going to spend time taking a Sabbath for the Lord. So the beautiful thing about the Sabbath is it helps you. And this, I know this study seemed probably like I was just forceful and saying, got to keep the Sabbath and all that. But I look at it as a joy, as a beautiful tool, because, and I'm not saying, I'm just learning about it now, the seriousness of it. I've always known about it. It's always bothered me. I always looked, I thought, I since I'm a Bible teacher, I'm studying the Bible every single day. So I'm not thinking, I'm missing much out on my spirituality. I'm like, extra day, I'm already in it every day. So it's like, I just kind of put it aside, but it always nagged on me that it was a day, and all the other justifications just never added up. And I think it's the Spirit's way of telling you there's something more to this. And then I decided, lately here, different circumstances came together where I think God just really kind of brought me he wanted me to look at this closer. And, but it is the one thing that helps you just by doing that one thing, no matter what you're doing, whether it's farming and you put too much pride in your farm or your business or youth sports. All you got to do is just say that Lord's Day, nothing on that day, you've conquered idolatry in a big way. You might not have you might still worship that idol the other 6 days, but what I think will happen is when people observe the Lord's Day and they say, no, this is the Lord's Day, it's His day, we'll set up banners and celebrate Him like we do birthdays or do whatever, anything to make it holy and special, right? I think that taking that rest gives you the opportunity to look back and reflect upon the other things that you're doing the other 6 days, and now put it in perspective and say, do I really need that? Do I need to do this? What I'm saying is I think it protects you from idolatry, not only on that day, but also when you move into the next week. You're making better decisions on where your priorities are. But when everybody knows that when you stop, you have time to think. Okay? But when you're a slave, and this is why, like in Egypt, I guarantee you why the Pharaoh and all and why Satan wants to keep us as slaves. So he doesn't want us to stop and relax and reflect at all. He wants us to be consumed with something. That's why we have all these devices. He doesn't want us. Sorry, I just went crazy on there and my screen's gone. But literally, he wants us, if he can't consume us with work, what is he going to consume us with? Entertainment. He wants to fill all that time so you can't stop and reflect and think, because he wants to keep you serving your idols. And for any of us to say that we're not, that we don't need the Lord's Day, that we're perfectly immune from idols, it could be that we're blinded and we have an idol we're worshiping, and we just don't want to give up that idol. We want to keep worshiping that because that's the way idolatry is. What did the Israelites, when they wanted to continue with their idolatry? It was stubbornness, righteous. No, I'm right, you're wrong. I don't have to do this, right? To God. And so I think the Sabbath, honestly, I'm sitting here every day thinking about it. You know, I've been studying it a lot. I'm seeing the beauty in it, just the peace of mind and the joy that comes with it. And I just want you guys to know that as I'm talking about Nehemiah. But it does, to enjoy that beauty, you have to have the gates, the bars, the guards out there. Otherwise you're not going to have, if you don't protect it, you won't have it. Okay? Now think about what people do with their idols. I know I'm rambling on, but it's kind of fun. We build walls around our idols, the things that are really, really important to us, right? And we build protections around those, and God forbid we break through that wall, somebody will get mad, right? You're not taking that away. Why don't we do that for God? Nehemiah did that for God, but we literally build walls and gates and protect our idols. It could, for many people, I mean, you look at, this has been, a huge thing is professional sports. It's become not only youth sports, but professional sports of all kind have really taken over the Sabbath rest. The natural tendency is, well, it's a day of rest, it's a day of enjoyment, but that's only half of the day. The other day is keep it holy. And how do we do that? But anyways, I'll stop rambling. Are there any more questions? One more? Okay.
All right. Tulsi's next X says, question off topic. I asked a friend who is rapture ready, what happens to people who don't believe in the rapture? He didn't have an answer. Any ideas what our rapture brethren believe about this?
That's a good question. Yeah, if you don't believe in the rapture, so if you don't believe in the rapture, what happens to you? Yeah, what rapture people believe about that?
Is there a third coming?
A third coming? Right.
And that if he's rapturing, then he's coming back again. So there's a third coming.
Yeah.
So it doesn't fly.
No, I think.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah, the rapture. I don't know what they think. They probably think if you're not a good rapture believer, you stay behind and you suffer.
Well, Find out.
Yeah. But, yeah, I mean, well, think about it. I would always go to the opposite. Okay, if you're teaching everybody they're going to be raptured, what if they're not? Are they prepared to endure the tribulation? The whole Bible teaches us to endure. I mean, this life is a test. It's endure. Yeah, our day-to-day life is a test, but the great tribulation, which the people that believe in rapture, they want to escape that. It's not going to be a great time for us. We're not going to love every moment of it. But after it's all said and done, the overcomers are going to be singing songs about it and about how they made it through in Revelation chapter 15. And so it'll be any obstacle you overcome in life, you always when you do look back, no matter how hard it was, if you overcame it, you have a sense of satisfaction. But if you're not prepared mentally and spiritually for that, honestly, if I was a rapture believer and I really thought it was in the Bible, logically it would make more sense for me to prepare for the tribulation. And then if I was raptured, then that would be like, oh, a beautiful gift, But Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me." And so I don't think he meant it to be any easier for us than it was for him.
I think our loved ones are raptured away already, so. And anybody that in that form, it was a rapture. They were taken.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, the people that die before us, they may be blessed in the sense that they don't have to go through the great tribulation. Everybody's gone through tribulation and testing, but not the great tribulation.
And back when I was younger, like around 1970, liquor stores weren't open. You'd have to go to a grocery store and buy 3-2. I don't even know if you remember 3-2, but it was like half the strength of regular beer.
Yeah.
So the liquor stores obviously didn't enjoy that the grocery stores were making money on Sunday. So somehow little Satan sneaks his way in. We'll do away with that. So now we can sell evil spirits from a store.
That's recent, in just a couple of years that they did that.
I think it's been like 10 years in Minnesota, I think.
It'll
No.
be a great falling away first.
But I remember back when I was young and not deep into God's law, I can remember people, and I might have even done it once myself. It was a Sunday, and we wanted to have beverages, so it was like, oh, we can drive over to Wisconsin and get it.
Heathen.
It's only 30 minutes away.
So if there's any good-looking families out there that we can have move and make this big cult you're talking about, that'd be great.
Put the fence up.
Put the fence up.
Well, that may happen.
Start our own, what do they call those?
Commune.
A commune.
Yeah.
We're already getting
Reach
one
out
up
to us.
north ready.
We got 5 good-looking kids, so.
Jacob, we don't want to advertise. I'm not your merchandise. Well, actually, it says when Nehemiah said we're not going to give our daughters or take daughters. So you kind of are our merchandise. Just teasing you. No, it's not merchandise in that sense. It was, but marriages back in those days were more arranged. The families talked to each other, and it's not so much like that anymore.
Maybe 3 camels and 2 donkeys.
Yeah,
Couple acres of land would be good.
yeah. Any other questions or comments? Joshua? No, none for you. All right. Well, we thank everybody for joining us. We will continue, like I said, we'll continue on in this series of studies. We're going to try and leave no stone unturned because I know there are still a lot of scriptures that people have in their minds and they're thinking, well, wait till we get to that. What about this or what about that? We'll cover those things. But until then, stay in his word every single day so that you can be a Christian overcomer. God bless.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you and thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching